so here we are, the last teaching. And where we left off last night was we were talking about how I believe the sages of Israel connected the Akeidah to a story of death and resurrection. And we already started down that road, and we saw numerous connections between the story of the Akeidah and between the story of Ishmael's banishment and the Shunammite woman. Now, before we continue along that line, I want to kind of backtrack a little bit and just cover a few points that I had not covered during the teaching. So, for instance, one of the connections that we made between the story of the Shunammite woman and the story of Abraham and Sarah was when she said, "It is well." Now, I didn't really go into detail on what the connection was. So first, I want to ask you a question. Think of the Akeidah. Think of the Akeidah when Abraham is about to bind Isaac, and we know that in Abraham's mind, he is thinking, okay, I have to sacrifice my son. I have to bring him up as an olah. Now think of that, and think of the fact that the Shunammite woman, that her son had died. And even though her son had died, 2 times she winds up telling someone, "It is well." Okay? Now, can you guys think of, when she said, "It is well," do you know what the thematic connection is to the story of Abraham and Isaac? She says, "It is well." Now, her son has just died. She says, "It is well." There's a connection to the Akeidah. Yes, he did. That's the connection. Abraham knew. And what phrase, in the story of the Akeidah, what phrase is mentioned? What phrase is mentioned where we know that Abraham knows that he was, "I and the lad will return." Okay? "I and the lad will return." So what I'm saying is that when the Shunammite woman, when she said, "It is well," those 2 times, it's thematically connected to when Abraham said, "I and the lad will return." You see, because both of them were full of faith despite the circumstances. And the circumstances were the same in both stories. On the one hand, you have the Shunammite woman where her son has died. Now, I couldn't imagine that myself, to have my son die and then someone say, "Well, how's it going?" and just say, "It's well, all is well." And the reason why she could say that was because she was full of faith. And she knew that once she got to Elisha, that he was going to straighten the situation out. Okay? That's what she knew. And so likewise, you have a similar situation with Abraham, where Abraham, he knew that he had received the promise of God that through Isaac, that the Lord would raise up a mighty nation. And so even though Adonai has said, "I want you to sacrifice him," he knew that Adonai was faithful to his promise, and he could see that if he did sacrifice his son, which he was willing to do, then Adonai would raise him up. Okay, so that's kind of the connection there. Another one that I wanted to make that I didn't make is that when Abraham and Isaac, when they left to go to Mount Moriah, it says that Isaac carried the wood. Okay? It says Isaac carried the wood. And of course, we know that Isaac is actually a picture of the Messiah, right? And so what that's teaching us, now that we have the Gospels, again, we know that Yeshua carried that crossbar that he was going to die on, right? Okay? So there again, we have a shadowy image of Isaac acting out the death of the Messiah. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. The Akeidah does have certain allusions, to death and resurrection, even in and of itself, even without connecting it to the Shunammite woman. And so again, this whole concept of the Tanakh giving us shadowy images, and the illustration that I gave you, where if you saw my shadow, if there's a wall separating us, if you saw my shadow, you would be able to tell certain details about me, but not everything. And so likewise with Isaac carrying the wood that he was going to die upon. It is a prophetic picture of Yeshua who will carry the crossbar. So really what we could say is that the Tanakh prophesies that the Messiah will carry his crossbar. Okay? That's basically what we're saying. It was a shadowy image. Could everyone have figured it out before Yeshua came? No, you couldn't figure it out because all of the details weren't there. But once the Messiah came in the fullness of time and did the work of redemption, now we can see fully, and that's the way Adonai intended for it to happen, because he didn't want to reveal the full plan during the time of the Tanakh. Another point that I wanted to make is again what I try to do in the weekly lessons that I send out is I try to. We talk about more than just Messianic prophecy, okay? So what we do is we go through the Torah portion, and so each week I'll send the lessons out, and what we do is we analyze one portion of the Torah, one part of the Torah portion. Okay, so we cover lots of other subjects, but one of the things that I try to do in the Torah lessons is connect the New Testament to the Old Testament, because many people Many people think that, especially New Covenant believers, New Testament believers, because they have this idea that the Old Testament, that was for way back then for them, right? For the Jews, that was for them, and the New Testament is something current for us now. They don't even, because of the fact that that's part of their paradigm, okay, they don't even seek to reconcile the two, okay? And so a lot of people, they think the New Testament is something different than the Old Testament, okay? People really do believe that. And they don't know what to do with the Old Testament. And I understand, because I was there too, before, getting a Hebraic understanding of the Scripture. And obviously there's still a whole bunch more that we need to understand. But when you break it down, we know enough. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, if we know that much, then we're well on our way. Okay, so everything else is icing on the cake. So it's not like we have to know everything. And that's something that we do need to guard ourselves against, is thinking that we have to know everything, okay? Every single event, like when is Yeshua coming? When is the rapture going to be? And da-da-da. You know what? There are a lot of end-time events that I'm going to tell you now. This is what I really believe. I believe that there are a lot of end-time events that no one's ever going to figure it out until after it happens. Because I believe that Yeshua's first coming is in many ways a picture of what's going to happen at the second coming. The prophecies are there, but not everyone didn't understand everything. And I think it's going to be the same way with a lot of end-time events, because everybody's, trying to, okay, all right, when is this going to happen, and getting all these timelines and everything. And you know what? The bottom line is we're not going to, I don't know, for example, we'll know about 50% of the timing or 70% of what. All I'm saying is that I can guarantee you we're not going to know 100% of everything with regard to the Messiah's second coming. There are going to be certain aspects of his second coming that we're not going to figure out until after it happens, just like at his first coming. So you have the disciples who Yeshua told them to their face. He told them to their face, Messiah must die, be buried, and resurrected in 3 days. And even after he died, even after he appeared to them, they still didn't understand it. Finally, they understood it after he appeared to them. And then it says, then they thought about what he said. But even though he was just in their face saying, I'm going to have to die, I'm going to have to suffer and die and be buried and raised again on the third day, they didn't understand it, even though he was telling them. And so there are going to be certain aspects of that. And I don't know why I went off into that. I'm kind of lost right now. But I was trying to talk about connecting the Old Testament with the New Testament. And but there's certain things, even though we don't need to know everything, obviously there's certain things the Father wants us to know. And so a lot of people just have trouble connecting the Old Testament to the New Testament. Well, if once you, again, as you begin to develop a habit of thinking thematically, the Old and New Testament will connect together. And you will see that they are not two separate books written to two separate people at two different time periods, that it's actually just one complete revelation. And actually, the New Testament, I kind of look at it as more of commentary on what's already written in the Tanakh. Okay? You have your Torah, your first 5 books as your foundation. That foundation will help you understand the rest of the Old Testament or the Tanakh, right? And then once you understand the Torah and the rest of the whole Tanakh, that's really going to help you understand the New Testament. Because see, people who are not grounded in the Torah and the rest of the Old Testament, those are the ones that have a problem understanding what the New Testament is really trying to say, especially somebody like Paul, you see? Because people go to Paul and say, well, see, he said we're not under the law anymore. No, that's not what Paul said. You just don't understand what he was saying, okay? And so here's an example. Remember when Yeshua, he said, if any man will come after me, let him take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever will try to lose his life shall save it, and whoever tries to save his life will lose it, okay? Now, we like to look at that as if, at least I can remember myself, just as before understanding Hebraic roots, thinking of that as a New Testament teaching on discipleship. Okay, well, what I'm here to tell you is that actually what Yeshua was doing was he was actually teaching a Torah lesson. Okay? When Yeshua said, if any man will come after me, let him take up his cross and follow me, he was teaching Torah. Okay? And the way we can see that is if we understand that if we see the picture of Isaac, okay? Now, a lot of us think Isaac was this little bitty guy, but the sages, they tell us that Josephus says in his writings, of course it's not inspired, he says that Isaac was probably around 25 years old at the time of the Akeidah. Most of the Jewish sages, they say that he was 37 at the time of the Akeidah. See, now, again, we have to think, when the Old Testament says a young lad, it does not always mean this 2 years old, okay? The bottom line is, I don't know how old he was, but the indication is that he was not a little child, okay? With that in mind, what it means is this. When Abraham went to bind Isaac was essentially a strong man at the time. So what that means is that we actually can look to Isaac as an example of faith just as much as we can to Abraham. Because Isaac allowed himself to be bound by his father. Okay? So you see what I'm saying? So in other words, not only do you have Abraham acting in faith where Abraham is willing to offer his son, look at the picture that Isaac gives us. Because Isaac allowed himself to be bound by his father and was going to let his father slay him. And so there again, we see again what Yeshua said, no man takes my life, but I freely lay it down. Okay, and that is pictured for us in the Akeidah where Isaac, who was not a little bitty child, where Isaac allowed himself to be bound by his elderly father. And so what we see then is that Isaac is carrying the wood, Isaac is carrying his cross. And Isaac is willing to do what? Give up his life. Exactly what Yeshua said. He that will come to me, he must carry his cross, take up his cross daily. Whoever tries to save his life will lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, which Isaac was willing to do, then you will gain your life. So again, when Yeshua said that, he was just teaching Torah. See? And so again, see, once we begin to understand how to connect the Old Testament and the New Testament thematically, we will see that they're saying the same thing. It's the same thing with being born again and these issues of, well, the Jewish people, they got saved by keeping the law, and then we get saved by being born again. No. They got born again just like we do. There is no difference. It's just that we don't understand the language of being born again for back then. Anytime you see in the Old Testament where it says circumcise your heart instead of that was the Old Testament way of saying get born again. Okay? But that's a whole nother lesson. So what I want to do, though, is remember we started off and I gave you a few midrashim where some of the sages of old saw death and resurrection in the Akeidah. And so what I want to do before we jump back into the lesson that we left off on, I just want to read to you a couple more. And again, remember the midrashim are not to be taken literally. What they were trying to do is they were trying to fill in gaps in the story. And what they did is they made thematic connections to other scriptures, which then became the basis for them making up these stories. They did this to hide this wisdom, and they did a good job because most people read the midrashim, and that's what they said. They said that people are going to read these and say, well, these things are just ridiculous. Where in actuality, the goal behind a midrashim is not so much the story itself, but the goal behind a midrashim is to find out what other story in the Tanakh was used as a basis to create this story. Okay, and we've already, as of the last teaching, we've already seen that the Akeidah is clearly connected to death and resurrection through the Shunammite woman's son. But here are a couple other midrashim just to give you a flavor for them. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay Yitzchak his son. Yitzchak answered and said to Abraham his father, "My father, bind my hands rightly, lest in the hour of my affliction I tremble and confuse thee, and the offering be found profane, and I be cast into the pit of destruction in the world to come." Now the eyes of Abraham reached unto the eyes of Yitzchak, but the eyes of Yitzchak reaching to the angels on high. And Yitzchak beheld them, but Abraham saw them not. In that hour came forth the angels on high, and said these to these, "Come, behold, two righteous ones alone in the midst of the world. One slayeth, the other is slain. He who slayeth deferreth not, and he who is to be slain stretcheth out his neck." Okay? And notice how it says two righteous ones alone in the midst of the earth. And see, now that we know, we already know that Abraham was a righteous one because he was willing to offer his only son whom he loved. Okay? We know he was righteous because he believed the promise, and he figured that, Adonai is just going to raise him up from the dead. But now we know that Isaac is a righteous one also, because Isaac was an adult by all standards, and Isaac was willing to lay down his life. That is more a statement of faith just about to me than Abraham's was, that he would be willing to allow his father to slay him. So I see that when it says here two righteous ones. Okay, all right. So here's another one, just to give you a flavor again for how they interpreted this. Concerning the ram, it is said, and he shall now right. Concerning the ram, it is said, and he shall slaughter it on the side of the altar northward before the Lord. It is taught, when Abraham our father bound Isaac his son, the Holy One, blessed be he, instituted the sacrifice of the two lambs, one in the morning and the other in the evening. What is the purpose of this? It is in order that when Israel offers the perpetual sacrifice on the altar and reads this scriptural text northward before the Lord, the Holy One, blessed be he, may remember the binding of Isaac. Okay, so if you remember, during the times of the temple service, there were two daily offerings, the Tamid offerings, one in the morning, a lamb offered in the morning, and one offered in the evening. This is to be a perpetual offering. And this is what he's talking about. They're saying basically that when they offer the lamb, that the Holy One, he will remember the binding of Isaac. So see, in the sage's mind, they connect all the offerings back to that one there. Here's another one. O our God and God of our fathers, remember us with remembrance for good. Visit us with a visitation for salvation and mercy from the everlasting heavens. Remember on our behalf, Lord our God, the covenant of loving kindness and the oath which you swore to Abraham our father on Mount Moriah. May the binding with which Abraham our father bound Isaac, his son, upon the altar be seen before you, and the manner in which he overcame his love in order to do your will with a perfect heart. Thus may your love overcome your wrath against us. Through your great goodness, may your anger turn away from your people, your city, your inheritance. Remember today the binding of Isaac, Akeidah Yitzchak, with mercy to his descendants. And there again, we see the whole idea of the Jewish people seeing merit or favor being stored up in that act for future generations when they needed deliverance from their enemies. So here it is again. And of course, we know that's exactly the truth. Messianically speaking, it is because of the sacrifice of Yeshua that we receive forgiveness of sins, that we receive deliverance, deliverance from death, and the very basis of us not going to the lake of fire, being written in the Lamb's book of life, and the very basis of our resurrection. So if we read 1 Corinthians 15, it says that what? If Yeshua has not been raised from the dead, then your faith is in vain, because his resurrection is the basis of your resurrection. You see? And so what I'm saying is that the sages, they saw, and I don't have that one with me, but specifically, they said that when he was quote unquote, again, quote unquote, resurrected from the dead, that it says, in this manner shall the dead be raised. So they saw in that, and see, so they're very, very close there. And let's look at one more. The Lord will see this binding and forgive Israel every year, and to save them from retribution, in order that it will be said on this day in all futurations, on the mountain of the Lord, Isaac's ashes shall be seen, heaped up and standing for atonement. Now, let's listen to this phrase again. The Lord will see this binding and forgive Israel every year. Now, think about that phrase. The Lord will forgive Israel every year. When was it that Adonai forgave Israel every year? On the Day of Atonement, right? On the Day of Atonement. And on the Day of Atonement, what kind of offerings did we have? The 2 goats. Remember? The one that went on the altar and the one that was sent out into the wilderness, right? And so we see again how now we know, in other words, what we're saying here is that when it says he'll forgive us every year, that's an allusion to Yom Kippur, right? And they have connected that to the Akeidah, which is exactly what we did yesterday when we saw that Ishmael on the one hand is giving us a picture of the death of Messiah. Isaac is giving us a picture of the death of Messiah. Isaac is the one who is actually being slain on the altar. Ishmael is sent out into the wilderness like the scapegoat, okay? And so that's how they saw these things, okay? And they saw them thematically, okay? All right, so let's keep going, and let's just give a quick little review here of what we covered last night. So we're going to look over here. We said that from 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8 through to the end of the story was a story of the Shunammite woman. And we saw all sorts of thematic connections between the story of the Shunammite woman and certain passages in the book of Genesis. And we saw that from 2 Kings 4, 8 through 17, that there were all sorts of thematic connections to Genesis 18, 1 through 12. We saw that 2 Kings 4, 18 through 21 had all sorts of thematic connections to Genesis 21, 1 through 15. And finally, we saw that 2 Kings 4:22 to the end of the story had all sorts of thematic connections to Genesis 22, 3 through 14. And again, Genesis 18, 1 through 12 is the story of the promise of the birth of Isaac to Abraham and Sarah in their old age. Genesis 21, 1 through 15 is the story of Ishmael's banishment into the wilderness. And Genesis 22 is the story of the Akeidah of Abraham and Isaac. And we saw that the first half of the story of the Shunammite woman basically brought us to the death of the child. Okay? The first half of that story, up into verse 21, brought us to the death of the child. So in other words, we could summarize the first half of that story as it brings us to the death of the child. And then we saw in the second half of the story, from 2 Kings 4:18 to the end, these were all of the events associated with the resurrection of that child. Okay? And, all right, and so what we saw then is we saw clear thematic connections, and what I'm doing is I'm suggesting to you that this is the basis for the idea of death and resurrection in the story of the Akeidah. Okay? Let's see here. Let's look at some more messianic gleanings in this story. Barren women. Now, remember yesterday when I asked you guys, I said, okay, I'll think of some other story that's thematically connected to Abraham being old and Sarah being barren, and you guys started naming Rivka, Hannah, and all those other names. Those were good connections, okay? They just weren't, the ones that I was looking for. I was looking for the Shunammite woman, and now you know why, you see, because the story of the Shunammite woman has a zillion thematic connections to our story. But we want to make a connection between the Shunammite woman and Sarah. We've already done that, but we can also make connections to Rebecca and Rachel, because remember Rivka or Rebecca, for a while she couldn't conceive. Remember, Isaac had to pray for her because she couldn't conceive initially. And of course, we know the story of Rachel because that's Jacob's wife. Remember, Jacob married Rachel and Leah. And remember, Leah was just having child after child after child, and Rachel was barren. So we see this continuing theme of barrenness. And then we go on and we see it with Hannah. Remember Hannah, she was the wife of Elkanah, who had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah, right? And remember, it was a situation similar to Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, right? Because Peninnah, Elkanah's wife Peninnah, she had lots of children, right? And Hannah had none. And Hannah, it broke her heart that she could not give Elkanah, her husband, children. It's the same story as Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, you see. But we saw that. And then we saw someone suggested Manoah's wife, okay? So Manoah, he's the father of Samson, okay? So remember I said that we're gonna get to all of these. Here's the point. All of those women, the Shunammite, Sarah, Hannah, Elizabeth, Manoah's wife, we're not gonna deal with that one because, not that it doesn't belong there, but it just takes more explanation. But they all needed supernatural help to receive, okay? They all needed supernatural help to conceive. So people will say, well, where is there a prophecy of the virgin birth? And what I would suggest to you is that these are prophecies of the virgin birth. Okay? Because again, we have to remember that the Old Testament is a shadow. And so as a shadow, here's the thematic connection between all of these women and Miriam, who had Yeshua. Every last one of those women needed supernatural help to conceive, especially Sarah. We're really going to look to Sarah and the birth of Isaac as a picture, as a prophecy of the virgin birth. Sarah, it was impossible for Sarah to conceive a child. Okay, it was totally impossible because, as she said, the manner of women has ceased with her, and Abraham was an old man, right? So, as far as we're concerned, with the fact that the manner of women has ceased with her, it's impossible for her to have a child, right? The only way she was able to conceive a child was through supernatural intervention by Yahweh. Okay, that was the only way. That is thematically connected to Miriam, the mother of Yeshua, because it was impossible for Miriam to conceive a child. But why? Because she had known no man. Okay? So the reasons why Sarah and Miriam, on the other hand, could not have children are different. With Sarah, it was because she was barren and was no longer producing the ovum, right? But with Miriam, it's just because she had not known a man, right? But what thematically connects those two women is the fact that they could not conceive naturally beyond supernatural help. And so here again, we see a shadow. And that's why Again, as we think thematically, we have attention to well, I don't want to say if you pay attention to details, you have to pay attention to details. If you begin to look at little bitty minutia and you say, oh well, Sarah, she knew a man. Whereas, if you start trying to compare it like that, then of course you're going to miss it. The whole idea is Colossians 2:15 and 16, that the things in the Tanakh, and especially the holy days and the commandments, they are a shadow of the body of the Messiah. That's exactly what Colossians 2:15 and 16 says. It says all of those things, Sabbaths, new moons, festivals, they are a shadow of good things to come. The body is of the Messiah, or the substance is of the Messiah. In other words, it's the Messiah's body that casts the shadow of the feasts, the festivals, and the holy days. So as you begin to look at the feasts, as you begin to look at the festivals and new moons, and I'm going to add other Torah commandments in the Tanakh, as you look at the Torah commandments and feasts and festivals, you are looking at a shadow of the Messiah. And if you're looking at his shadow, what that means is that you're going to see certain details, but you're not going to see others. Okay? And so that's what's happening. That's what's happening as we look to Sarah. As we look to Sarah, Sarah needed supernatural help to conceive. That's the connection to Miriam. She needed supernatural help to conceive because she knew no man. Different circumstances, but the connection is clear and it's there. Okay, so how can we see death and resurrection in the lives of these women? In other words, what I'm suggesting to you is that we see death and resurrection in all of these women's lives here. It's a sign of the Messiah. Each one of these women, each one of these stories here actually teaches you something about the Messiah. And so we need to see death and resurrection in that. Well, if you look at Romans 4:19, we're going to look to Abraham and Sarah. Look at how Paul saw death and resurrection in the birth of Isaac. This is how Paul saw it. This is the Hebrew mind at work. Romans 4:19, and not being weak in faith, he did not consider his own body already dead, right? Okay, since he was about 100 years old. In other words, you know the picture, he's not able to produce the seed. I mean, that's the image. He's saying Abraham's body is dead. Listen to this, nor the deadness of Sarah's womb. You see, this is Paul, the Jewish Torah scholar, thinking Hebraically, seeing death and resurrection in the story of the birth of Isaac. In the birth of Isaac, he said that Sarah's womb was dead. The deadness of Sarah's womb, right? So in other words, when Sarah conceives a child in a dead womb, as he's picturing it, it is life springing forth from death in its resurrection, you see? And so, see, Paul, Paul, again, he's Jewish. Paul is a Torah scholar. Paul is looking at all of these pictures of death and resurrection, and he sees that in the story of Sarah's womb. You see? That's what's happening right there. Now, how old, and remember, we talked about the sign of the Messiah, and what we said is that whenever you see life springing forth from death, that it's telling you that it has something to do with the Messiah, right? It has something to do with the Messiah. So what I'm telling you is that when Sarah conceived and when she bore Isaac, it is actually, the Messianic prophecy there is the virgin birth, is the fact that Miriam would conceive a child through supernatural help, just like Sarah did. And remember I said you always see the number 3 in some kind of way, right? How old was Abraham when Isaac was born? 100 years old. Now let's think about something. Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born, right? Now remember, we've already read the passage where in the previous year, that's when the two men came to Abraham and Sarah and said, at this time, at this point, next year, you will have a son, right? So how old was he then? 99, right? 99 is 3 times 33. There it is again. So in other words, here again we see From Romans 4:19, Paul says that Sarah's womb was dead. The deadness of Sarah's womb, because she was past childbearing years. Her womb is dead, and yet from her womb sprang forth life. It's a picture of resurrection. The promise that that would happen the next year came when he was 99, and 99 years old, 3 times 33. So there's life, death, and the number 3. And see, it's everywhere. It's all over the scripture. And see, the reason why we can gain this understanding is because Adonai is showing us this theme of life, death, number 3. Here, there, here, there. How many? I mean, we've already seen a number of examples, and we haven't even gone through all the examples. We got a whole Bible left where we can show you this concept of life, death, and the number 3. And in the Torah commentaries that we send out, if you go through them, you get a whole year's worth. You get a whole Torah's worth of life, death, and the number 3. Because it's a theme that comes over and over. And you want to know why? Because it's the gospel. And the gospel ought to be the one subject that's taught about the most in the Tanakh. Would we not agree? The fact that the Messiah would live, that he would die, and that he would be buried and resurrected in 3 days. It's the gospel. It needs to be one of the most prominent doctrines, and it is. The death, burial, and resurrection of Yeshua is the most prophesied event in the whole Old Testament. But we have to be able to see the shadows. We need to understand when Scripture is talking about Messianic prophecy, and the sign of the Messiah is what helps us see that. Okay, so here's another way that the Torah is trying to get us to make connection. Remember Sarah's unbelief? Remember she said, she laughed, right? And then one of the men, in response to her laugh, said, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Genesis 18:14a. Remember that? Remember the 2 men? They said at this time next year she's going to conceive a son. And she's standing in the doorway of the tent, and she's like, yeah, right, okay? And then, they confront her on that, and, she's denying it, saying, "Oh, no, I didn't say it." And then in Genesis 18, it says, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Well, now, let's go to the New Testament in Luke chapter 1, verse 37. And remember, an angel comes to Miriam. See the connection there? Angel came to Abraham and Sarah. Okay, anyway, I hadn't thought about that one. See, that's what I'm saying. They just keep, you could constantly making connections. But remember, the angel came to Miriam and told her, "Hey, you're going to conceive a child, da-da-da-da-da." And now Miriam is not in unbelief, but she just says, "How can this happen since, I've known no man?" And what does the angel tell her? Eventually, in that conversation, "For with God, nothing will be impossible." Now, am I stretching it by saying that those 2 statements are the same thing? That they're really the same thing? Am I stretching that? I'm trying to make this connect. Is that not objective? Is anything too hard for the Lord? Genesis 18:14a versus "For with God nothing will be impossible." Luke 1:37. It's the same statement. And again, there's a hint there, remez. Here's that remez again. And so what's supposed to happen, you see, is when a Jewish person, for instance, when they took the gospel in the book of Acts and they went to synagogues, see, what they did was I believe that they brought up points like this because Adonai was, what he wants us to do is when we read this, for with God nothing will be impossible, if we know the story of the birth of Isaac, we're supposed to immediately think, that sounds familiar. And then we go search our scriptures and we see, wow, that's exactly what was said at the birth, concerning the promise of the birth of Isaac. So here again, as I'm saying, the birth of Isaac through Sarah's dead womb is a messianic prophecy of the virgin birth. It's a shadowy image. It's not the exact same image, but it is a shadowy image. And that's the essence of that scripture. Okay, so let's get back. 2 Kings chapter 4:20b versus Genesis 21. We already talked about how the Shunammite woman's son died, and Hagar's son is brought to death's door. We already saw that, how those were thematically connected. The point we saw through the thematic connections of the Shunammite woman's story with the story in Genesis 18, that when the Shunammite woman's son died, that was thematically connected to when to when Ishmael was laid under the tree to die. Okay? All right. By the way, I always do this towards the end. If any of you want the slides to this presentation, just email me. I'll email them to you. If you want the slides to the presentation so you can go over it, I'll email them to you. All right, 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 21, verses 21-15. The Shunammite woman all right, we just said that. All right. And we already talked about, I and the lad will go yonder, we will worship, and we will return to you. Again, well, let's bring out this point here. In 2 Kings 4, 22-23 and 26, that's when the woman says, it is well, it is well. That's thematically connected, as I said earlier, to when Abraham said, I and the lad will go yonder, we will worship, and we will return to you. It's a statement of his faith, because he was going to slay his son. Now, some commentators, they say that Abraham was lying and deceiving the two men, because he didn't want to tell them. You see, here's the natural mind at work. You see, the natural mind in dealing with this passage. Remember, I said that the Akeidah is one of these troublesome passages, right? Because if you read through the Bible, you know that Father Yahweh human sacrifice is abhorrent to him, okay? This is an aberration. This is evil. It's confusion is what it is, okay? That's what it is, and he makes that clear. So then people have trouble, well, but he just said sacrifices. He just told Abraham to sacrifice his son. And so, commentators have grappled with this. And so when Abraham tells the two young men, I and the lad will go yonder, and we will return to you. Okay. Well, the natural mind is thinking like this. Well, we know that Abraham is going to slay Isaac, right? He's going to offer him up. And so, obviously, Abraham, he doesn't want to tell the two young men what's really going to happen, that he's going to kill Isaac. So he's just kind of deceiving them. But see? And see, this is where we get into interpretation. This is why, here's a good example right here of why you need to make thematic connections to other passages to help you get the proper interpretation for a text, okay? Because see, if you take a text by itself, you could come up with all kinds of interpretations for the Akeidah. We've already seen the people in Philo's day, they were like, there's nothing to that. Look, we got these other stories. So see, what they're doing is they heard the story about the Akeidah, but then they made thematic connections to other stories, in their culture, you see, and they judged the story of the Akeidah based on their own stories, from Sparta and Messiania and those other cultures. And so they looked at the story of the Akeidah and said, that's nothing compared to this, right? And so then other people, they look at the Akeidah and what they say is, well, that there's no way, we don't even believe that God actually commanded Abraham to do this, right? Now, here we have another view where someone is looking at this story and they're interpreting it, and they interpret Abraham's statement to the two men, I and the lad will return, we will go and we will worship and we will return to you. They interpret that as Abraham lying to the two men. Well, is that true? Right. So, right, he had already lied before, right? Of course, she was his sister, though. But anyway, so here we have a situation where what's the right interpretation? How do we properly interpret Abraham's statement, I and the lad will go yonder and we will return to you? Now, I can understand how someone could, on a natural level, could come to this passage and say, yep, Abraham was lying to those guys because Abraham is going to slay his son. So obviously he's lying. But is that the correct interpretation? No, it's not. So once we thematically connect this story to the Shunammite woman, which becomes abundantly obvious that we should do because of all of the thematic connections, then we can see for sure that Abraham's statement was a statement of faith, because it's thematically connected to when the Shunammite woman said, all is well. All is well. So in other words, by making the proper thematic connections, Adonai brings in extra, information from another biblical story to help us keep us on the right track. Okay? All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to get another witness here. I'm sorry. Just a second. Let's see something here. All right. All right. So we've already seen how this story of the Akeidah and the banishment of Ishmael and the promise of the son is thematically connected to the story of the widow of Zarephath. Now, in case we didn't get it, all right? In case we didn't get it, that the story of the Akeidah is actually a story of resurrection, that is at least one, because remember, Hebrew block logic, more than one right answer, right? On the one hand, it was a test, right? We know it was a test. Genesis 12 through Genesis 22, the first night. The first test and the 10th test. We know it was a test, he said, and the Lord tested Abraham, right? So it is true that the story of the Akeidah was a test of Abraham's faith. That's true, right? However, it is also true that the story of the Akeidah is symbolic, as the one Jewish commentator said. But see, he was saying symbolic at the expense of it being, literally true also. But we know it is symbolic because it's given us all these pictures of the work of the Messiah, right? That's two things that are true about the Akeidah, right? But there's something else that's true about the Akeidah. It has something to do with death and resurrection, okay? That's why it's thematically connected to the woman of Shunem. But in case we didn't see it, there's a biblical principle that says, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every truth be established. Now, the story, and this is where you can give the answer again, the story of the Shunammite woman is thematically connected to another story in the Torah. Now, let's think about it. For you guys, I want you to think about it. The story of Elisha raising the Shunammite woman's son from the dead is thematically connected to another story in the Tanakh. Eliyahu and who? Come on, Bible scholars. Elijah and who? The widow of Zarephath. Remember the story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath? What we're going to do now is we're going to compare the story of Elisha and the Shunammite woman to the story of Elijah and the widow of Zarephath. Okay? All right. I forgot to do that earlier. So how many connections are there between these two stories? Now, this is what I want you to do. Open your scriptures to 1 Kings chapter... Open your scriptures to 2 Kings chapter 4, because I want to show you something here. All right. The story of the Shunammite woman starts in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8. Okay? 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8. Now, that's the story of the Shunammite woman. What I want you to draw your attention to is look at 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. You see that story? It's the story about a young woman who is, it's a story about a woman who's a widow. Her husband was one of the prophets, right? And she comes to Elijah and says, the creditor, I owe some bills, and the creditor is going to take my 2 sons. All I have is this jar of oil. And he tells her to go and get jars of oil from all of her neighbors, right? And then to take that one jar of oil that she has and starts filling the other. All right, that's what that story is about, okay? All right. Now, that's the story right before the Shunammite woman, right? Now, let's look at the widow of Zarephath, which is the story in 1 Kings chapter 17. The story of the widow of Zarephath is thematically connected, first of all, to this first story here, okay? The story of the widow of Zarephath in 1 Kings 17:9 is actually thematically connected to two stories in 2 Kings 4. The first story is 2 Kings 4:1 through 7, about this widow, the widow of the prophet, and then it continues and it's thematically connected to the widow of Zarephath also. All right, so let's look at the connections. Both stories are about widows. Both women bring a financial problem to the attention of the man of God. Okay? This widow and the widow of Zarephath, you know, they're running out of food. 2 Kings 4:2 versus 2 Kings 17:10-12. Both prophets ask the widows a question. All right? I'm going to have to zoom because I'm running out of time because I was kind of doing a little extra thing. I'm going to go really quickly here. Just listen to the connections. Both widows have oil in a jar. Both of the sons face well, we're going to skip that one because I have to explain that one and we don't have time. Both women do something unusual with their meager possessions. All right, they had to do something with their oil. With the widow of Zarephath, Elijah, this woman is dying, her and her son, they don't have enough food, and Elijah says, fix me some bread first. He said, you take that little bit of oil and you fix me some bread first. And because she obeyed hospitality, just like Abraham, because she showed him hospitality, a miracle happened and that oil was multiplied. Same thing happened with the woman in this other story. All right, the oil is multiplied. Both women are landlords and have a prophet living in the upper room. Now we're going to a connection between the widow of Zarephath in 1 Kings 17 and 2 Kings 4, the Shunammite woman. They're both landlords. They both house the prophet in the upper room. Both passages mention how the boys grew up. The son of the Shunammite woman and the widow of Zarephath died. Both women chided the prophet, Elijah and Elisha, for, having given them a son and then letting him die, okay? The dead son in both stories is placed on the prophet's bed in the upper room. In both stories, the prophet raised the son to life by prostrating himself over the boy. All right, so the story of the resurrection of the Shunammite woman's son is clearly thematically connected to the story of the resurrection of the widow of Zarephath's son. That's the whole point. It is another witness of resurrection, if we didn't see the first one. We've already seen that the story of the Akeidah is thematically connected to the Shunammite woman, which is the story of resurrection, and the story of the Shunammite woman is clearly connected to the widow of Zarephath, another story, two witnesses that the Akeidah has something to do with death and resurrection. Okay, so we're going to skip that. So here we go. The final unmistakable proof that the ancient sages understood the story of the Akeidah, that the story of the Akeidah was a story of death and resurrection. You want to know how that we know this is true? This is how we know. The stories of the widow of the prophet and the Shunammite woman in 2 Kings 4, 1 through 37 comprise the Haftarah for Parashat Vayera. That's why we know. Now, you guys remember, with every Torah portion, there is a reading from the prophets, right? There is a reading from the prophets with every Torah portion. So the Torah portion is called the Parashat HaShavua, the weekly Torah portion, right? And along with each Torah portion, there is an Haftarah, a reading from the prophets that is thematically connected to the Torah portion, right? All right, the Parashat Vayera, Genesis 18:1 through 22:24, which is the story of the Akeidah and the birth of Isaac. The Haftarah for this Torah portion is the story of the Shunammite woman. And these Haftarah portions, now we need to talk about when they came about. What I want to say is that the sages of the past, they chose the story of the Shunammite woman about the death and resurrection of that son as the Haftarah to complement Parashat Vayera, where we have a story of the Akeidah. That's what they chose. Okay. Now let's talk about the Haftarah. No one is sure when the Haftarah portions were chosen or when they were instituted. No one knows for sure. It is amazing. Just everywhere I look, every reference source, no one knows. Okay, but most scholars agree that they were possibly instituted during the period of the Maccabean revolt between the Jewish people and King Antiochus IV in around 165 BCE. All right, but no one knows for sure. What we do know for sure, though, it was before the first century. It was before. In other words, the Haftarah readings for the Torah portions were chosen by some sages of Israel. No one knows, which is amazing because they know where the Shemona Esrei comes from, which is like 310 and 410 BCE, but no one knows where the Haftarah selections came from. But they were before the first century. The Haftarah, right, they were before the first century. We know this because the most ancient historical reference for the evidence of Haftarah readings is found in the New Testament. Luke 4:16 through 19. So he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read, and he, Yeshua, was handed the book of the prophet Isaiah. He was reading the Haftarah for that day. One more proof that's even more powerful. Acts chapter 13, verse 15. And after the reading of the law and the prophets, that's the Torah portion and the Haftarah portion, the rulers of the synagogue sent to Paul, saying, Men and brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say on. Okay? In other words, what I'm trying to say is that even though we do not know exactly when the Haftarah portions were selected, we know that they were selected before the first century. Furthermore, most people believe that it was instituted around 165. And the reason why they believe that is because Antiochus IV, the Greek ruler, when he came and did the abomination of desolation in Israel, what he did was he forbade Torah reading. So what the Jewish people did was here's their thematic mind going to work. Okay, fine, we can't read the Torah portion. But guess what? We can get the same lesson because we know the Torah is thematically connected to all the stories in the prophet. So we can read the prophets and still be studying the Torah. That's exactly what happened. Okay? So even though no one knows exactly when they were instituted, we see Paul reading, we see in the book of Acts chapter 13 there that after the reading from the Torah and a reading from the prophets, because they were doing the Torah reading and the Haftarah. So what's the whole point? The whole point of this is what I'm saying is this. When we first started off, we said some kind of way the sages of Israel, they saw a picture of death and resurrection in the Akeidah. Okay? And I presented some information from one book to you where the gentleman, he thinks that it was well, if you ask modern Jewish commentators, they say that the midrashim that popped up in the medieval times that attribute death and resurrection to the Akeidah, they say that those grew up as a response of Judaism to Christianity. Remember the one-upmanship? Well, your Yeshua died, but so did our Isaac. Your Yeshua said, my God, why have you forsaken me? But Isaac willingly went to the sacrifice. That's one view, that they arose as a response to Christianity. And some people think that they arose as a response to Christianity in the first century also. Another view is that these themes of death and resurrection entered Christianity and Judaism from ancient paganism. And what I'm here to say is that neither one of those are true. Because as you go back, first of all, you go to the Shemona Esrei, which was written, 3rd and 4th century BCE. They already saw resurrection associated with Isaac, okay? And then as last and final proof, what I'm trying to say is that the Haftarah reading for Parashat Vayera is the story of the Shunammite woman. So in other words, whoever those sages were, we don't know who they were, but whoever they were, they saw the connection between the Akeidah and death and resurrection in the Shunammite woman, in that story. They saw the connection. That's why they made the story of the Shunammite woman the Haftarah for Parashat Vayera. And those Haftarah portions were before the 1st century. Okay, we don't know exactly how far. Okay? All right. So we have covered a tremendous amount of ground. And so I'm just going to kind of recap what we did, if I can remember this. We started off by just looking at Genesis chapter 12 to 22. And what we did was we saw a bunch of thematic connections, right? That was just a primer on thematic connections. And we saw that it was actually a chiastic structure, so you learned what that was. And then the next day, we looked at different Jewish interpretations of the Akeidah as far as its purpose. It was the basis of Jewish martyrdom. Okay, some people said it was a response to Christianity. There are some people that didn't want to accept the Akeidah, that said, Father, that Adonai didn't want Abraham to even do it. We just looked at a whole montage of different views of the Akeidah. And then in the third teaching, what we did was we just studied a little bit about midrashim, so that we can understand what these midrashim are and what their point was. We looked at how to see resurrection in the story of the Akeidah logically, okay, just by following the commandments. And we also saw the sign of the Messiah. And then what we did was we took a closer look at the Akeidah by looking at all the chiastic structures and parallelisms that we had seen. And finally, we connected the Akeidah to the story of the woman, the Shunammite woman, and suggested that that was actually, that is how the sages of Israel saw death and resurrection in the story of the Akeidah, because they're the ones that chose the Haftarah portion. So, it's been a long weekend, but I've enjoyed it. And I hope that you guys have. And I just want to thank Herb and Donna and Mary Lou and everyone for inviting me and my family here. This place is home. We're family. We love you guys, and we appreciate you guys having us come here, and we're looking forward to coming again. And I just want to say thank you to all the people here. We have a lot of new friends now, and we just want to bless you guys and thank you for having us here.